The South China Sea. The year 1433. The largest wooden ships ever built are coming home from their final voyage. They are 9-masted giants, some of them, by the old accounts, 4 times the length of the little ship Columbus would sail 60 years later. In the world we know, the Ming court orders these fleets burned, banned, and forgotten. China turns its back on the open ocean. But what if it hadn't? What if those vast fleets had kept sailing east and east across the Pacific until Chinese ships dropped anchor off the coast of the Americas? What would the last 600 years of human history have looked like? To understand this alternate history, you have to first understand something almost unbelievable. In the early 1400s, the most powerful ocean-going navy on the entire planet was Chinese. Between 1405 and 1433, the Ming dynasty sent out 7 enormous naval expeditions. They were commanded by a remarkable figure, an admiral named Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch from China's southwest who rose to the very top of the imperial court. The scale of these fleets is hard to hold in the mind. A single expedition might involve hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. Sailors, soldiers, translators, doctors, craftsmen, even agricultural experts. And the largest ships, the so-called treasure ships, were, by the traditional Chinese accounts, simply colossal. The figures in the old sources are debated, and some historians think they are exaggerated. But even the cautious estimates describe vessels far larger than anything Europe would put to sea for generations. These fleets did not creep along the coast. They crossed open ocean. They reached Vietnam and the islands of Indonesia and the great ports of India. They reached the Persian Gulf. They reached the coast of East Africa, Mogadishu, and the trading cities of what is now Kenya. A giraffe, famously, was carried back from Africa to the wonder of the Ming court. This was a civilization with the shipbuilding, the navigation, the wealth, and the organization to project its power across thousands of miles of ocean. In 1433, China was, without question, the leading maritime power in the world. And then it stopped. After the 7th voyage, the treasure fleets were ended. The great ships were left to rot or broken up. The shipyards fell silent. In the decades that followed, the Ming state turned hard against ocean-going trade, at certain points even making it a crime to build a large sea-going ship with more than a certain number of masts. The reasons were complex. The voyages were ruinously expensive. The court was divided. The officials who distrusted the eunuchs distrusted their fleets. China faced a renewed threat on its northern land border and chose to pour its money into the army and the Great Wall instead. So the question is not whether China could have reached the Americas. China had the ships. China had the skill. The question is what would have happened if the Ming court in the 1430s had made one different choice and kept its fleets at sea. In the real world, the fleets were abandoned because a faction at the Ming court won an argument. In our alternate timeline, they lose it. We do not need a fantasy. We do not need a different China. We need one different outcome to one real historical court debate. In the years after the 7th voyage, the Ming court genuinely argued about the fleets. The expeditions had powerful enemies, but they also had defenders, officials who saw real value in the trade, in the prestige, in the reach. At one point, decades later, when the court considered reviving the voyages, An official is said to have hidden or destroyed the old navigational records, specifically to prevent it. So the divergence is this. In our timeline, the anti-fleet faction wins, decisively, and the ocean-going navy is dismantled. In this timeline, the defenders win. Not a total victory, but enough. Perhaps the northern land threat, in this timeline, is slightly less severe in a key decade, freeing money for the fleets. Perhaps a particular emperor simply finds the voyages glorious and stubborn, and refuses to let them die. Perhaps the merchants of the southern coast, who profited enormously from the trade, make their case just a little more effectively. However it happens, the result is that the treasure fleets are not abandoned in the 1430s. They are scaled back. The ruinous 100-ship grand expeditions give way to smaller, cheaper, more regular voyages. But the shipyards stay open. The skills are not lost. The ocean-going navy survives. And here is where the geography takes over. A China that keeps sailing keeps pushing. Trade routes, once established, tend to extend themselves. Merchants look for the next port, the next market, the next source of profit. Chinese ships in this timeline consolidate the routes to Southeast Asia, to India, to Africa. They strengthen their hold on the Philippines, on the islands of the Pacific Rim. And from there, over decades, driven by trade winds and ocean currents, and the simple human urge to see what is over the horizon, they begin to probe the great empty Pacific. We should be honest about how hard this is. The Pacific is the largest ocean on Earth. Crossing it is a far greater feat than crossing the Atlantic. It would not happen in one heroic voyage. It would happen the way real exploration happens, island by island, current by current, across decades, with losses and dead ends and ships that never came back. That is the divergence. Not a single dramatic discovery, just a China that this time kept its fleets, and so kept moving, patiently, across the widest water in the world, until its ships touched the western shore of the Americas. So picture the moment. Somewhere in the latter half of the 15th century, a Chinese expedition makes landfall on the Pacific coast of the Americas. We cannot know exactly where. The currents and winds of the Pacific might carry such a fleet to the coast of what is now Mexico, or further north toward California, or south toward Peru. But let us imagine the most consequential landfall, contact, over a few decades with the great civilizations of the Americas. Because the Americas of the 15th century were not empty. They were home to vast, sophisticated societies. In central Mexico, the Aztec Empire ruled millions of people from one of the largest cities on Earth, Tenochtitlan, a metropolis built on a lake with causeways, aqueducts, floating gardens, and a great market that astonished the first Europeans who later saw it. Far to the south, along the spine of the Andes, the Inca Empire stretched for thousands of miles, a state bound together by an extraordinary network of roads, by storehouses, by a system of administration that managed mountains, deserts, and millions of subjects without writing as we know it, and without the wheel for transport. These were not primitive peoples waiting to be discovered. They were empires, complex, powerful, and in 1450, near the height of their strength. But they shared one terrible vulnerability. The peoples of the Americas had been separated from the peoples of Asia, Europe, and Africa for many thousands of years. And in that long separation, they had been spared, but also left defenseless against the great crowd diseases of the Old World: smallpox, measles, influenza. In our timeline, when European ships arrived, those diseases arrived with them, and the result was the deadliest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. By many estimates, something close to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died of imported disease in the century after contact. And here we must be brutally honest, because this is the hardest truth in the whole episode. Chinese ships carry old world diseases exactly as European ships did. A China that reaches the Americas in the 1450s brings smallpox to the Americas in the 1450s. The Great Dying is not avoided in this timeline. It is not even softened. It is, if anything, simply moved, arriving on a different coast from a different direction decades before Columbus was ever born. An alternate history is not a fairy tale. This one does not save the peoples of the Americas. What it changes is who arrives, and when, and what happens next on a continent about to be reshaped by a catastrophe no one in 1450 could see coming. Here is where the alternate timeline diverges most sharply from the world we know. Not in the disease still comes, but in everything that the disease made possible. In our timeline, the Spanish conquest of the Americas followed a particular and devastating pattern. A relatively small number of Spanish soldiers, a few hundred men, in the case of both the Aztec and the Inca conquests, toppled empires of millions. How was that even possible? Historians point to several brutal factors working together: disease above all, epidemics that shattered these societies just as the Spanish arrived, killing leaders, killing warriors, killing faith. Steel weapons and armor, horses, and gunpowder against opponents who had none of them. And, crucially, politics. The Spanish were brilliant at finding local enemies of the dominant empire and turning them into allies. The Spanish came not to trade and not to settle a far coast. They came to conquer, to seize land, to extract gold and silver, to convert souls, and to build a vast colonial empire. Now think hard about how Ming China approached the wider world. The treasure fleets of Zheng He, for all their overwhelming power, were not on the whole conquering fleets. They could fight, and they did, crushing pirates and intervening in a few local conflicts. But their central purpose was different. They came to display the magnificence of the Ming, to enroll distant rulers into a system of tribute and trade, to bring back wonders and exotic goods. The Ming model was not a colonial empire of settlement and extraction. It was a vast system of trade and prestige, of distant kings acknowledging the supremacy of the Chinese emperor and sending gifts, while keeping their own thrones and their own lands. So the alternate contact looks fundamentally different. A Chinese fleet reaching the Americas in the 1450s does not arrive with the goal of toppling the Aztec or the Inca state and seizing its land. It arrives looking for trade, for ports, for tribute relationships, for silver and gold and the strange new crops of a new world, but not, in the first instance, for conquest. We must not romanticize this. The disease still kills on a horrific scale, and a society gutted by epidemic is desperately vulnerable. A trading power can still exploit, still dominate, still extract on cruel terms. This is not a gentle contact. It is only a different one. But the difference matters enormously. In our timeline, the great American empires were not just devastated, they were dismantled. Their ruling classes were destroyed or absorbed, their religions suppressed, their lands seized, their states replaced outright by a foreign empire. In the alternate timeline, a society that survives the epidemic, even a shattered, grieving, much reduced society, is far more likely to survive as a state. A diminished Aztec successor kingdom, a reduced but continuous Inca state, trading with China, paying tribute perhaps, adopting Chinese goods and ideas, but still standing, still governed by its own people, still, recognizably, itself. So let us follow that thread forward. When two halves of the world meet, they do not only trade goods. They trade living things, crops, animals, and ideas. Historians call this the Columbian Exchange. In our timeline, that exchange reshaped the entire planet. The Americas gave the Old World potatoes, maize, tomatoes, chili peppers, chocolate, and much more. The potato and maize in particular were so productive that they helped drive centuries of population growth across Europe, Africa, and Asia. And the Old World gave the Americas wheat, horses, cattle, pigs, and, catastrophically, its diseases. In the alternate timeline, the same exchange happens, but it flows along a different channel. The first bridge between the Americas and the wider world is not the Atlantic. It is the Pacific. And the first society to receive the new American crops in bulk is not Europe. It is China. Think about what that means. The American crops, maize, the sweet potato, the peanut, the white potato, are extraordinarily well suited to feeding large populations. In our timeline, when these crops eventually did reach China, arriving the long way, generations later, they helped fuel a massive expansion of the Chinese population. In the alternate timeline, China gets those crops far earlier and gets them first, before anyone else, direct from the source. A China already wealthy, already populous, already the leading power of the Eastern world, now also gains, decades ahead of its rivals, the crops that can feed still more millions. That is an enormous head start. But we should hold the dark side of the exchange in view as well. Those same Chinese ships carry the Old World's diseases to the Americas, as we have said, and they carry Old World animals, horses, and pigs, and cattle, which transform American landscapes and societies just as profoundly and just as unpredictably as they did in our timeline. And there is a quieter exchange, one that may matter most of all: ideas. In this timeline, the great American civilizations, reduced by disease, but not destroyed as states, are in sustained contact with Chinese astronomy, Chinese metallurgy, Chinese writing, Chinese engineering. And the exchange runs both ways. Chinese scholars encounter American calendars, American agriculture, American mathematics, American knowledge of plants and medicine found nowhere else on Earth. In our timeline, that two-way conversation barely happened. The conquest was too total, too fast, too contemptuous. So much American knowledge was simply destroyed, codices burned, scholars killed, traditions broken. In the alternate timeline, surviving American states keep their knowledge alive, and it enters the bloodstream of world civilization as a living tradition, not a salvaged ruin. Some of the deepest changes in this timeline are not in the Americas at all. They are in China itself. Remember what actually happened in our history. After 1433, the Ming state turned inward. It abandoned the ocean. It came to see the sea less as an opportunity and more as a threat, a source of pirates, of smugglers, of dangerous foreign contact. For long stretches of the following centuries, China's official policy discouraged or restricted private overseas trade. This had enormous consequences. When European ships, Portuguese, then Dutch, then British, arrived in Asian waters in the centuries that followed, they found a China that had largely surrendered the ocean to them. The Europeans built the trading networks. The Europeans built the naval power. The Europeans eventually dictated terms, and by the 19th century, a militarily outmatched China would suffer a long, bitter century of foreign humiliation. Now imagine the alternate China, a China that never abandoned the sea, a China with a continuous, centuries-long tradition of ocean-going trade and naval power, a China with bases and trading partners not only across Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, but across the Pacific and on the western coast of the Americas. That is a profoundly different China. A maritime China does not let the ocean become someone else's highway. When European ships finally round Africa and enter the eastern seas, they do not find an open field. They find the dominant naval power of the planet already there, established, confident, and far stronger than they are. We should be careful not to overstate this. A maritime China still faces the same internal challenges our timeline's China faced. Enormous size, the constant pressure of the northern frontier, the difficulty of governing hundreds of millions of people. Dynasties still rise and fall. The Ming itself may still eventually collapse, as it did in our timeline, in the 17th century. But the relationship between China and the rest of the world is inverted. In our timeline, the modern centuries are the story of the West reaching outward and reshaping the globe, of European ships, European empires, European trade, knitting the world together on European terms. In the alternate timeline, much of that knitting is done by China. The Trans-Pacific trade route, silver and crops and goods flowing between Asia and the Americas, becomes one of the great arteries of the world economy. And the power that controls it, that sails it, that sets its terms, is not a European one. It is the empire that in our timeline chose to burn its fleets, and in this one chose to keep them. Now we have to widen the lens and ask the obvious question: what happens to Europe? In our timeline, the European voyages of exploration were one of the great turning points of all history. Portugal pushed down the coast of Africa. Spain sent Columbus west and stumbled into the Americas. Within a few generations, European powers had built globe-spanning empires. And those empires made Europe rich. American silver, American crops, the wealth of the new colonies and the new trade routes poured resources into European economies. That wealth, many historians argue, was one of the foundations of Europe's later rise, of the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and eventually, the Industrial Revolution. Now think about the alternate timeline. Europe still sends out ships. The same pressures are at work. The hunger for Asian spices, the competition between kingdoms, the advances in ship design and navigation. Columbus, or someone like him, still very likely sails west and reaches the Americas from the Atlantic side. But the Americas that European ships reach in this timeline are not the Americas of our history. When the Spanish arrived in our timeline, they arrived first. They met societies that had never seen a European, never seen a horse, never faced a steel sword, and fatally, never been exposed to old world disease. In the alternate timeline, none of that is true. By the time European ships reach the Americas, decades of Chinese contact have already happened. The great epidemics have already swept through, and the surviving American societies have already begun to recover, to adapt, to rebuild. They already have horses. They already have iron. They already know that there is a wider world of powerful empires and ocean-going fleets. And crucially, they are not alone. An American state in this timeline is a trading partner and perhaps a tributary of the most powerful empire on Earth. A European expedition that arrives thinking of conquest is not facing an isolated, disease-shattered kingdom. It is facing a society backed, armed, and watched by China. So the European empire in the Americas, that vast, world-changing project of our own history, is, in this timeline, either far smaller, far more contested, or simply does not happen at all. Europe still reaches outward. Europe is still ambitious, still inventive, still hungry. But Europe in this timeline arrives at the great game of the oceans to find that the board is already set and that the strongest player is someone else. There is one consequence of this timeline that is larger than any single empire. It is about where the modern world economy is centered. In our timeline, the centuries after 1492 saw something historians sometimes call the Great Divergence. For most of human history, the wealthiest, most advanced, most populous parts of the world were in Asia, above all, China and India. As late as the 1700s, China was, by many measures, the largest economy on Earth. And then, over the 18th and 19th centuries, the balance flipped. Western Europe, and later North America, surged ahead, driven by the Industrial Revolution, by colonial wealth, by new technology, by the conquest of global trade. The center of economic gravity moved from east to west. That divergence is one of the most important facts of the modern world. It shaped which nations grew rich and which grew poor. It shaped which civilizations' languages, laws, technologies, and ideas came to dominate the globe. Now think about the alternate timeline. A China that kept its fleets is a China that captured the Trans-Pacific trade. A China that got the productive American crops generations early. A China that remained, continuously, the leading naval and commercial power of the world's largest ocean. In that timeline, the Great Divergence looks completely different. It may be much smaller. It may be much later. It may not happen at all. Or it may happen in reverse. Imagine an industrial revolution that begins not in the coal fields of England, but somewhere in the workshops of a wealthy, outward-facing, resource-rich maritime China. It is not a fantasy. China in our own real history had, at various points, much of what an industrial takeoff requires. Coal, huge markets, advanced craft industries, sophisticated commerce, a large, skilled population. Historians still argue about why the takeoff happened in Europe and not in China. Some of their answers turn on exactly the kind of factor we have been changing tonight. Access to resources, to new lands, to the wealth of a new world. We should be careful. We cannot say for certain that this alternate China industrializes first. Industrialization is a tangle of causes, and a maritime empire is not automatically an industrial one. But what we can say is that the modern world of this timeline is not centered on the West. The dominant language of global trade may not be a European one. The dominant model of the state, of law, of science, of the city may not be a European one. The whole modern world in this timeline may simply speak and think and trade with a different accent and call a different civilization its center. Let us follow the alternate timeline all the way down, past the 15th century, past the age of sail, into the deep modern consequences. Start with the most uncomfortable one. This is not, in any simple way, a kinder timeline. It is tempting to imagine that a world centered on China rather than Europe would somehow be gentler, less violent, less imperial, less cruel. But that is sentimental, and history does not support it. The great American dying still happens in this timeline. Tens of millions of people still die of imported disease. That catastrophe is not a European crime in this timeline. It is simply a consequence of two long-separated halves of humanity finally touching. The hand that carried the smallpox is different. The dead are just as many. And a dominant maritime China is still an empire. Empires extract, empires coerce, empires demand tribute and crush rivals and put down revolts. A Pacific dominated by Chinese sea power is not a Pacific of peace and harmony. It is a Pacific with a different master, and masters in every century and on every ocean have rarely been gentle. Now turn to something quieter and stranger. Think about the movement of peoples. In our timeline, the centuries after 1492 saw vast, often forced migrations. Above all, the transatlantic slave trade, which carried millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas in one of the greatest crimes in human history. In the alternate timeline, the American economies developed differently, shaped by Chinese trade, by surviving American states, by Pacific rather than Atlantic connections. The specific institution of the transatlantic slave trade, tied so closely to the specific European plantation colonies of our history, may be far smaller in this timeline, or may not exist in that form at all. But we must not leap to comfort. Coerced labor was not a European invention, and it was not unique to the Atlantic. Slavery and bondage existed in many societies, in many forms, for thousands of years. The alternate timeline does not abolish human cruelty. It only reshapes the particular map of who is bought and sold and carried across which sea. And turn, finally, to the deepest consequence of all: language, faith, the furniture of the modern mind. In our timeline, the global spread of European power carried European languages to every continent. It carried European Christianity across the Americas, across Africa, across the Pacific. It made certain European ideas about law, about rights, about science, about how a state should work, into something close to a global default. In the alternate timeline, that does not happen. A world knit together substantially by China is a world where the languages of trade and learning are different, where the dominant philosophies and religious traditions reaching across the oceans are the traditions of East Asia. It is not a worse world and not a better one. It is a world built on a different foundation, thinking different thoughts, in different words, all because one fleet, in one century, was not burned. Some changes ripple farther than trade routes and empires. They reach into how a whole civilization understands its place in the world. In our timeline, the European age of exploration left a permanent mark on the Western imagination. It created a powerful, enduring story, the story of the West, as the civilization that discovered, that explored, that reached out and remade the globe. That story shaped how the West saw itself for 500 years as the active force in history, the center, the maker of the modern world. It is a story of enormous pride and, increasingly, of enormous and necessary reckoning, because the same age that the West long celebrated as discovery was, for much of the world, an age of conquest, of disease, and of bondage. In the alternate timeline, that story belongs to someone else. It is China, in this timeline, that tells itself the story of reaching outward, of crossing the great ocean, of knitting the world together, of standing at the center of the modern age. And China, in this timeline, also inherits the darker half of that story, the reckoning, the catastrophe carried in the ships, the long moral weight of having been the empire at the center when two worlds collided. And there is one more thread, the hardest one of all to weigh. In our timeline, the civilizations of the Americas were not just conquered. They were, in a profound sense, silenced. Their voices, their books, their sciences and philosophies and histories survive today only in fragments, painstakingly reconstructed from ruins, from the few codices that escaped the fire, from the accounts of the very people who conquered them. In the alternate timeline, those civilizations survive as living things, reduced by the epidemics, yes, changed and grieving, and forced to adapt to a suddenly larger world, but not erased. Their states endure, their scholars keep writing. Their knowledge enters the modern world in their own words, carried by their own descendants, not as a salvaged ruin, but as a voice that was never silenced. And yet, this is the uncomfortable heart of the whole episode. We cannot honestly call this the better timeline, or the worse one. It saves entire civilizations from being erased, but it does not save the tens of millions who still die of disease, It does not abolish empire, or cruelty, or the hunger of the strong to rule the weak. It only hands those ancient human failings to different hands on a different ocean. Both of those worlds are real possibilities. Both of them are honest readings of how history works. And both of them turn, in the end, on whether one court, in one palace, in the 1430s, chose to burn its fleets and look inward, or chose to keep them and sail over the edge of the sunset.